Okay, Professor Bessel, please.
We shall, we shall begin. First, let me thank you for organizing this. And I have to admit at the outset, this is something of a new experience for me, not merely because of dealing with the new technology and giving a lecture from a study in my house across 3 continents, but also because um, this is a bit of lived experience for me that some of what I want to talk about has to do with historical developments that I actually lived through in the UK and also in Germany. The first time, the only time that I've been faced with somebody holding a machine gun to my head was in the mid-1970s on the German Federal Railways during the time of the Red Army factions terrorist campaign. And I was an innocent but rather long-haired graduate student going to an archive in Göttingen when we were interrogated by armed police who obviously thought that I was suspicious. So this is the first time really that I've had the chance to talk about something to try to put into historical context, events, developments, which I witnessed in one way or another, and which leave me still with a number of questions. I should say at the outset that the title of the talk is Europe in Crisis with a question mark. And this is something that perhaps we can discuss at the end. So I could begin with perhaps perceptions and a comment which was made in the 1970s, well, toward the end of the 1970s by the master of my Oxford College, where I did my doctorate, Sir Alec Cairncross, who described the 1970s, and I quote, as the dismal decade. And I think this speaks to the way in which the 1970s often have been regarded, that is being seen as a political, an economic, and a social turning point in the history of post-war Western Europe, and being seen very largely in a negative light. And it's that which I want to discuss. In doing this, I want to take this in a fairly general way and to discuss 4 interrelated themes, interrelated aspects, which I'll try to work my way through. The first is what I think could be described as the failure of the state, with economic growth stalling in the 1970s and being replaced by what was termed stagflation. The second, which in many ways follows from the first, was the welfare state reaching its limits. The third is the upsurge of public violence and terrorism during the 1970s. And the fourth is how this was perceived, and particularly perceptions of violence and of the 1970s. So let me begin with this idea of the failure of the state and economic growth being replaced by stagflation. It strikes me that that one can see a number of rather fundamental shifts in people's attitudes and policymakers' attitudes toward the state and the state's role in the economy. And that the depression of the 1930s was seen subsequently, certainly in the aftermath of the Second World War, as a failure of the market. And that in order to prevent its recurrence, that one needed to have a more active, and one could have a more active role of the state, so that one saw as a remedy for the failure of the state in the 1920s and the 1930s, increased state intervention. And this, plus the wartime expansion of the state, led to a faith in state economic planning, the growth of the state, both East and West. And so one can look to what was referred to as planification in France, which was thought through active state involvement to move France beyond the stagnation which the country had experienced during the 1920s and 1930s. The German Soziale Marktwirtschaft, which also involved quite considerable state intervention, which was seen both as an antidote to the economic crises of the early 1930s and the dictatorial state interventions of the National Socialist period, of George Brown's national plan under the Labour government in the 1960s in the United Kingdom, Scandinavian social democracy, and also, I think, the 5-year plans in Eastern Europe. I'm not going to go into speaking about 5-year plans in Eastern Europe in this talk. But I think this was a general move or general change in perceptions during the post-war period. And so what one saw in the 1950s and the 1960s was increased state intervention and also stunning economic growth during what was probably the greatest sustained economic boom that we've ever seen during the 1950s and the 1960s. And not merely did one see tremendous growth, and particularly in the 1960s, when people were able to reap the fruits of this expansion and the fruits of increased consumer prosperity, but also of expectations that it would continue. And here's where I could refer back to my own expectations at the time. And I think as a witness, I can see that leaving aside relatively, now in retrospect, relatively small hiccups, setbacks, downturns, that we generally assumed, I certainly generally assumed as a young student, that this would just continue, that our experience was a very optimistic one of growing economic and social and also cultural progress. This then was followed in the 1970s, as we know, by a series of economic problems, as what were referred to in France as the Trente Glorieuses, the glorious 3 decades of the 1950s, 1960s, and into the 1970s, as these were followed by slow growth, stagnation, inflation, and increasing strike activity and strife. Now, if I can figure out how to operate this thing, I can show you this. You can see that growth rates, whoops, there we are, which were very impressive between both Eastern and Western Europe during the 1950s and the 1960s, fall in the 1970s. Now, many of the growth rates that you can see here in the 1970s by present day standards don't look that bad. But if one looks at these against the background of expectations at the time, expectations which are conditioned by the growth rates that you can see here during the 1950s and the 1960s, you can see the importance of this shift that I think every country on this list sees a significant decline in the economic growth during the 1970s, from 1973 onwards, as compared with the 13 to 14 years before. One also saw during this period increasing inflation. Yeah, there we are. Consumer price inflation. This follows the collapse of the Bretton Woods Agreement, system of fixed exchange rates, when the United States unilaterally terminated the convertibility of gold, of the dollar into gold in 1971. This initiated an era of floating currencies. And in many of the countries that we're looking at here, the UK, Italy, Finland, France, devaluations, and quite considerable devaluations, and also Spain, which then also fuel further inflation. And of course, there also was the huge increase in the oil price in the autumn of 1973, something which, by the way, occurred just a couple of months after I'd started work on my doctoral thesis when I was a student at Oxford. So, as a result of this, one saw that the Keynesian policies of demand management and increased state intervention, which during the 1950s and the 1960s had appeared to work, no longer appeared to be working. And this was referred to at the time as one of stagflation, that one had a combination of low growth, stagnation, with high inflation, which you can see in the table in front of you. And this leading to a rethink in the UK, obviously with Thatcherism, with monetarism, and in Chile with the arrival of what's been referred to as the Chicago Boys. Now this provides the basis, the context for the second theme that I want to discuss in a bit more detail, and that is the growth of the welfare state, which then reaches its limits. Now, during the 1950s, and on the back of the growth that I outlined, there was a huge expansion of the state provision of welfare in Europe. Again, both East and West, but I'm going to discuss what happened in Western Europe here. And one saw the proportion of resource which was devoted to social welfare growing enormously. And as we shall see, parallel to this development, one saw the proportion devoted to military spending declining also quite considerably. And so that what one saw was what's been referred to as, and I quote, the happy conjuncture of high economic growth and responsiveness to social and economic needs. So that between 1960 and 1975, the proportion of GDP devoted to social expenditure grew. Now, if I can once again call this up, whoop, well, that's not what I wanted to do. Um, so much for the technology. You'll have to take my word for it then before I ignore the terrorism graph for the moment. So that what one saw I'll just read out what I'd hoped you'd be seeing at this point. In France, the proportion of gross domestic product devoted to social expenditure increased from about 14% to over 26%. In West Germany, from 17% to 27%, nearly 28%. In Italy, from 13 to 20. Netherlands, 13 to nearly 30%. Sweden, from 15% to 27%. And the UK, from about 12% to nearly 20%. And one needs to keep in mind that this was during a period when the national product also is increasing rapidly in absolute terms. So social expenditure was a growing proportion of rapidly growing economies. So what does this mean for social welfare? Between 1949, 1950 and 1972, 73 in Britain, spending by the British central government increased 2.5 times in real terms. Its share of GDP rose and the starting point, I think we should note, is toward the end of the post-war Labour government, which initiated a huge expansion of the welfare state after 1945. The share of GDP rose, while the share of central government expenditure also increased, in this case from 20% to 28%. In comparison, during the same period, the share of defense spending fell by about 1/3. Between 1960 and 1972 alone, while GDP in Britain grew by a bit over 1/3, social spending almost doubled. And the largest component of British central government social spending was devoted to old age retirement pensions. And spending on them doubled as a share of GDP, as a share of GDP rose from about 3% in 1960 to over 4% in 72. So what we're seeing is a growing share of an increasing pie during this period. In France, one sees the same development. Social spending by the French government grew faster than gross domestic product. Again, if we adjust for inflation, both GDP and overall government spending grew from just over for nearly 100% between 1960 and 1972. Spending on social programs rose from 1/5 of GDP in 1952 to 1/3 in the middle of the 1970s, and from 13% of total government spending to 18% in 1973. And in contrast, one sees the same development with a decline in military spending. Looking at the Federal Republic of Germany, once again, it's the same set of trends. This was, as welfare spending and spending on social insurance increased rapidly, peaking during the early 1970s, as the social budget and central government spending on social welfare programs grew between 1950 and 1972 more than 8 times in real terms. And spending on the pension system fit the same pattern, growing from about 4 billion Deutschmark in 1950 to over 70 billion in 1972 in nominal terms. That's roughly 8 times when adjusted for inflation. Now, the optimism which was engendered in the course of this expansion of welfare, the idea that, it's growing, we can afford it, we can afford to increase it, we can provide greater and greater welfare for our population. This optimism fueled growth of the welfare state then stalls abruptly in the 1970s. And this is due to a combination of a lack of finance to allow the continued growth, the oil price shock of 1973 and 74, inflation, although it should be said that inflationary problems already were being seen before 1973, that is before the oil shock occurred, a rise in unemployment. And also it needs to be remembered, aging populations, and by the way, increasing resistance of citizens to pay higher taxes to fund all of this stuff. So that the growth and the belief that the growth could continue stops abruptly in the early mid-1970s. This, it has been seen, provides a background and context to an upsurge in public violence and terrorism. Now, the question that I'm going to want to address here, and I'm going to leave it as an open question at the end, has to do really with what the relationship between these two elements may have been. And I think that this is one of the central questions in the research project, which is being pursued in Valparaiso is about. So what one sees is a growth in urban unrest, particularly toward the end of the 1970s and the beginning of the 1970s. This is often amongst immigrant populations as unemployment rises. In France, from the end of the 1970s and the beginning of the 1980s onwards, unrest occurred repeatedly in the low-income suburbs around French cities, the banlieue. Again, areas with high immigrant populations, beginning with the first really serious outbreak of youth violence in one of these suburbs to the north of Lyon in 1979. And then in the summer of 1981, involving young Franco-Maghrebi stealing, racing, and burning hundreds of cars in the suburbs around Paris and Lyon. These were the so-called rodeos. In the UK, similar or parallel developments occurred with urban unrest in Bristol in 1980, and Toxteth in Liverpool, and Brixton in South London in April of 1981. The photograph which is on the poster for this talk is of a police car burning in Brixton in 1981, in April of 1981. And this is against the background of high and rising unemployment, which in the UK climbed nationally from around 400,000 in the mid-1960s, which in practical terms was nothing, to about 1.4 million at the end of 1979, to over 3 million in the summer of 1982. One also sees during this period the growth of terrorist groups and terrorism. Now we can come onto the graph, which you see here. And perhaps contrary to what many people today believe, it was the 1970s and also into the 1980s where one sees in Western Europe the highest number of people killed and the highest number of terrorist attacks occurring, and in more recent, much greater than during the 1990s and in more recent years. That the period that we're talking about is the high point of terrorist violence, with the Red Brigades, the Brigate Rosse in Italy, formed in 1970 by radical students, and one thinks of Renato Curcio. It's interesting, born in 1941, a student of sociology at the University of Trento in the 1960s. And these were people who sought to create a revolutionary state as they saw it through armed struggle, sabotage, bank robberies, kidnappings, and if I can do it, and murder. This is a picture of Aldo Moro, who was the former, well, had been the former Christian Democrat Prime Minister of Italy, and this is his corpse. The Brigate Rosse were inspired by Latin American urban guerrilla movements, in particular by the Tupamaros. In Germany, the Red Army Fraktion, again formed in 1970 by a generation involved in the extra-parliamentary opposition, the Außerparlamentarische Opposition, radicalized members of the 1960 student movement, recruited primarily from amongst the middle classes, also involved in sabotage, kidnapping, murder, and I mean, here we see the aftermath of car bombing in Munich in the mid-1970s. In Spain, one sees the growth of activity of the Basque terrorist group ETA. ETA had already been in existence for a decade, when in 1970 once again, it achieved prominence with the sentencing of 16 of its men for terrorist offenses. And it's reached its provisional high point with the assassination of the Prime Minister, Admiral Luis Carrero Blanco. This was what was left. Well, this was what was left after his car was blown up. This was the crater which was left in the street. The car, in fact, was sent over a 6-story building and landed in the courtyard behind the building. And I think I should note here parenthetically that the movement that Italy, Germany, and Spain were all post-fascist societies, and that perhaps one can see this violence in some way as a way of dealing with, or people perceiving that they were dealing with their country's fascist past. In the UK, we had the growth of Irish Republican terrorism, with the splitting of the Republican movement, upsurge of IRA violence in Northern Ireland, and in Britain, I should say, not in Britain as a whole, but in England, not in Scotland, in the wake of the civil rights agitation of the late 1960s in Northern Ireland. When the provisional IRA splits off from the official IRA, this is at the very end of 1969, after a nonviolent Catholic civil rights campaign was met with unionist and police violence. And then the offensive IRA campaign begins in 1970, once again, with a guerrilla campaign and bombings in Northern Ireland and in England, with street violence, riots, the deployment of the army. I mean, this is a picture of British soldiers being deployed on the Falls Road in Belfast. The Falls Road is in a Catholic area in Belfast in July of 1970. And with probably the worst of the worst incident of this being the violence of Bloody Sunday in January 1972, when the army shot 14 civilians dead. I think it's worth noting that in all of these cases, that the activists who were involved in this were really, I think one can see, if not of a post-war generation, the leading members of the Irish Republican movement of the 1970s, think of Martin McGuinness and Gerry Adams, were born in 1950 and 1948, respectively. But one sees in all of these cases, activists being amongst those people who came of age during the prosperous 1960s and then get involved in this sort of political violence in the 1970s. So that the political violence of the 1970s may be, at least in part, a product of prosperity and general and generational change, which takes place in societies that had become much wealthier over the previous 25 years. That is, post-war, in the post-war generations coming of age are the protagonists. And I think it's worth noting here the importance of generation in the changes which occurred in the 1970s. In 1970, the largest birth cohort in the Federal Republic of Germany among males was amongst those aged between 30 and 34. In France in 1970, the second largest birth cohort was amongst those aged between 20 and 24. And we're looking at large post-war birth cohorts after the losses and lack of births in the Second World War, and before the slowing down of the reduction of birth rates in the late 60s and into the 1970s. What also saw during the 1970s rising levels of recorded violent crime. And I know we can discuss this as well. There are huge problems in trying to understand and to draw conclusions from recorded crime statistics, but they do have their uses, both as an indication perhaps of some things which are going on, and perhaps even more importantly, of perceptions of what had been going on. In England and Wales, the number of murders increased from the annual number of murders from 282 in 1960 and 393 in 1970 to over 600 by 1980. Serious wounding and other acts of endangering life is the official term, increased from under 2,000 in 1960 to nearly 3,000 in 1970, then jumped to well over 4,000 in 1980 and to nearly 9,000 by 1990. Total violence against the person, which had been, as a category of crime, negligible in 1950, only about 6,000 instances, and about 15,000 in 1960, had climbed to 41,000 in 1970, and nearly 100,000 by 1980, and 184,000 in 1990. And then just one last set of numbers, total violent crime. And this is something which includes sexual crime, robbery, etc., increased from about 37,000 in 1960 to 70,000 in 1970 to 133,000 in 1980 and nearly 250,000 in 1990. That is something like 8 times as much as in 1960. There are similar patterns that one can see in the Federal Republic of Germany. Just very quickly, total crime in the course of the 1970s in the Federal Republic of Germany increased by roughly 60%, and grievous bodily harm increased by nearly 3/4 during that same period. Now, I think I've got a table here. I've just, once again, it seems to be skipping over what I'd hoped to be able to show you. I wanted to show you a table of total reported cases of crime in the Federal Republic, but I'm afraid you're just going to have to take my word for it here. So the question then is what this tells us. If you were able to see the table from Germany and also the more of the statistics coming from the UK, you'd note that most crime is not violent crime, but is in fact theft, fraud, and traffic offenses, which don't get included in the figures that I've been quoting, and which take up a huge amount of police time and take up a huge amount of the official statistics. And there's a question really about what then, how this might in fact be related to the trends and developments which I was discussing earlier. In particular, the question of how the changing context, economic context, and welfare context might have related to violence and violent crime. I mean, one place that people had looked or have looked at this has to do with public housing and public housing projects. For example, in the, to take 2 prime examples of this, the huge growth of public housing in France and the HLM, the Habitation à loyer modéré, this is rent-controlled housing, which came to house something like 1/6 of the entire country's population. And Sweden's Miljonprogrammet, this is the million program of the late 1960s and early 1970s. And the idea, the aim was to build 1 million new dwellings in a country which only had 8 million inhabitants. Now the intention, and again, this was in the frame of this huge increase in welfare that I outlined earlier, was to address housing shortages following the war, to clear old and substandard and often unsanitary dwellings, to offer their inhabitants and recent urban immigrants modern housing. However, many of these housing projects, dating from the 1960s, with high concentrations of immigrants. For example, ones that I know, the Planoise and Besançon in Western France, and Rinkeby in Stockholm, subsequently became sites of considerable unrest and of violence. There's also the question, and this is something which I can't really do more than touch upon here, and that has to do with violence committed within welfare institutions, something that we shouldn't forget. That is, what has been described by a research project being undertaken amongst others, Joanna Burke at Birkbeck College in London, of cultures of harm in institutions of care. That is, the violence which was committed in children's homes, in penal institutions, in psychiatric institutions, in church institutions, and so forth. And which has come to light increasingly over the last 10 to 20 years. However, and here's where I'd like to move on to what we may want to be discussing. However, this sort of violence, I think, is something which has always been with us, both in institutions and in poor districts, in slum districts or whatever. It's also very hard to establish correlations between economic difficulties and violence, something which my old friend Eric Munkinen analyzed in a brilliant study of murder in New York City some time ago, pointing out that correlation is not causation, and that it's very difficult, if not impossible, to make clear correlations between economic difficulties and rising, or for that matter, falling levels of violence. And so perhaps the supposed links between economic difficulties, welfare programs, pressures on the welfare state on the one hand, and violence on the other may have been overdrawn. So if that's true, if that's what we need to think about, what in fact may have been new in the 1970s? Perhaps what is new in the 1970s is in the way that this came to be regarded. And here we come to perceptions of violence and of the 1970s. How do we look back at the 1970s? And this was why I decided to include this picture of a T-shirt of what was a wanted poster during the 1980s of anarchist people who committed violence, the so-called Baader-Meinhof gang, which has then been sold as a T-shirt. There's a question of how then do we remember the 1970s? In October of 2016, I just noted a report of football violence in London in the Daily Mirror. The Daily Mirror, for those of you who aren't au fait with the British tabloid press, is one of the British tabloids. It tends to be the more left wing of them, but nonetheless, they described this football violence in London in October of 2016 as, and I quote, like being back in the 1970s, 7 arrests as West Ham and Chelsea fan violence turns the area into a bomb site, quote. It was like being back in the 1970s. And so perhaps what we are looking at, I should say, is increased sensitivity toward violence, increasing concern about violence, as much as increasing violence itself. There has been, and I think this is quite clear, growing concern, public concern about domestic violence and violence against women. This is an interesting change in the definition of domestic violence from the time when I was young in the 1960s, and in the early 1970s to more recently. Back then, 50, 55 years ago, domestic violence was something which was distinguished from violence outside the country. Domestic violence was violence which occurred within a country, so that many of the sorts of things that I've mentioned already, domestic terrorism, urban unrest, at that point were described as domestic violence. That's not how we describe domestic violence today. And many of these forms of violence and institutional violence, violence within the home, were things which went largely unnoticed until more recently. And the shift in these perceptions of violence, I would argue, begins in the 1970s. And I'll just mention a couple of, not examples, but of indicators of this shift. One which I think is really very important are the first shelters for battered women. The very first one was Erin Pizzey's domestic violence shelter. This is the Chiswick Women's Aid Centre in London, which was founded in 1971. By 1980, there were roughly 150 shelters in England alone. This was followed by similar developments on the European continent. The first Frauenhaus refuge in West Berlin was opened in 1976. Research by my old friend and colleague Dirk Schumann about corporal punishment in schools in West Germany. He's noted that at the end of the 1940s, almost all the Länder of the Federal Republic, the states of the Federal Republic, granted teachers the right to carry out corporal punishment. By the early 1970s, almost all of them had revoked it. In the UK, there was increasing focus on what the sociologist Stanley Cohen referred to as moral panic, and it was highlighted by the study of Stuart Hall, John Clark, and the collaborators at the Birmingham Center for Cultural Studies on policing the crisis, on mugging the state, and law and order, that these things were being focused upon in a new way. So what I'd like to suggest as I come to a close is that perhaps Western Europe may not, in fact, have been in crisis, in that despite all of the things which I outlined in the earlier part of my talk, despite all of these things, the political, economic, and social structures of Western Europe remained intact. And I think maybe this is one of the things that we need to focus on as much as on the various challenges to them. However, there seems to have been, and there continues to be, a perception of crisis during what is seen as an unstable and violent decade. So that is the question or concern that I'd like to leave you with. And one final thought, and since many of the participants in this discussion are in Latin America, there might be worth pursuing comparisons with what occurred in Latin America during the 1970s, whether there are parallels and what the differences may be. Let me suggest, and I'd be interested to hear your responses to this, that there was a similar or parallel optimism in the 1960s, followed with democratization and the chance for increased social welfare, followed by economic and political crisis in the 1970s. Although in Latin America, the violence was of a completely different order than what happened in Western Europe, with military coups with United States support and serious repression on the left. And that's something which, when one thinks about the military coup in Brazil in 64, or in Uruguay in 73, September of 73 in Chile, and the imposition of military rule in Argentina in 1976. This seems rather different from what occurred in Europe, although the social and economic tensions that provided the context for this had some parallels. So I'll stop there, open it up for discussion, and thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard.
Okay.